We're so excited to be here at a beautiful place, and our drive went well. So today we're going to answer the question. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Today we're going to answer the question, does heart rate variability contribute to our understanding of stress? And we're going to discuss that with a focus on our recent Horses and Humans Research Foundation-funded project entitled the effect of equine-facilitated psychotherapy on humans with veterans with PTSD and the horses as well. And so we'll be talking about interpreting the horse and human response to equine-facilitated psychotherapy, which we'll probably refer to as EFP during the talk. Okay. Oh. Okay. So I'm going to start off by giving you a little bit of background into our research program and how we came to have the methodology and expertise to do this major project that we did for horses and humans. And I want to tell you a little bit about my journey to this point because I'm a large animal surgeon at the Atlantic Veterinary College. So, and I was just talking to a few of you out there in the audience. As a surgeon, so I've been doing surgery, since I graduated vet school. I've been specializing. So that was in 1990. And I know surgery really well. And I always interpreted the behaviors of my patients mostly to keep myself safe. But probably doing that more subconsciously than consciously. And so during my last sabbatical, my sabbatical in 2014, I was interested in having a better relationship with my patients. And so I did a sabbatical on equine behavior and cognition. And that was really eye-opening. And maybe some of you have the same type of journey. But just to learn more about how horses learn and their cognitive abilities, and then I could better relate to them. So I use a lot of that knowledge in my day-to-day surgery practice because surgery has a lot of interaction with the horses when they're not actually anesthetized. So, and I teaching my students that. But so along the way of learning more about horses, their cognition and how they learn, and how I could better handle them, I started to pay more attention to when their behavior indicates they're stressed or fearful. And that's how I started to have an interest in being able to measure the stress in my equine patients. And then I got together with Bill, who's a human research chair, and we started to expand that. So that's a little bit of the way we got to this point of being interested. And our current research program focuses on understanding the interactions of horses and humans, and we've had a primary focus on the horses in these interactions. And we've learned throughout these projects, we've learned valuable information for our overall research program, those include things like learning about the heart rate monitors as a methodology, and cortisol and oxytocin. And we gave a webinar in February which gives more detail about some of these projects, where we advanced through our learning and methods and statistical analysis. And they include measuring stress during something simple like horses trained with positive versus negative reinforcement. And that was our first start to learning about the polar heart rate monitor and using HRV measures. And then we did a reliability study that's published on reliability of that specific monitor, which many of you probably use, and many of you may not have access to a portable ECG. So a lot of researchers use the polar heart rate monitor, maybe HeartMath, something different, but the gold standard is the ECG. So we need to know the reliability of the instruments we use. And then we actually did an interesting study where we measured stress in therapeutic riding horses. And we added the stress ethogram to our methods and salivary cortisol. And we did some studies looking at pain versus stress using pain scores and cortisol. And more recently, with the equine facilitated psychotherapy, we added oxytocin to the mix and we added the human component. So all the same data collection on the humans.
So everything we were doing up to this point was trying to make sense of how do we measure what's happening with our equine patients or the equine participants as they're involved in the various kinds of programs that are being used out in the public. And so we're trying to get, I'm a biostatistician, I work primarily with humans. When Laurie came in and said, how do you attach this heart rate monitor so that it actually gets the right measures, I started asking about the validity and the reliability of those devices and whether or not the scaling and the measurement techniques were appropriate for what was being reported in the literature. And so we started this journey about 5 years ago where we really started to investigate a lot of the nuances of the accuracy and predictability and precision of these measurements. So our plan today is to move a little bit away from the equine participants, but also to show that synchronization in the responses of both humans and animals as we're going through, or horses, as we're going through our studies, and how we can actually make sense of the data. That's my interest, and Laurie's interested in what's the well-being and what's the welfare of the horse as they are participating in a lot of these programs, especially in the rehab type programs. So today we're going to focus on a lot of our results from the psychophysiological effects of equine assisted therapy on horses and on the veterans as they were diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and involved in these different programs. So we're going to look at the measures of cortisol in horses and in humans, and oxytocin in horses and in humans, and then the various derivatives of heart rate variability, whether we're looking at the time domain or the frequency domain or the nonlinear domains of the heart rate monitors as we measured the horses and the humans' response to participating in the equine facilitated psychotherapy program. And so the three important takeaways from this talk today are that you would actually have an understanding of the complexity of evaluating stress from both an objective and a subjective perspective, to understand the efficacy of the tools that can be used to determine stress responses or the responses, behavioral responses of horses and humans, and then the value of the various metrics that we use to demonstrate both individual and synchronized responses of horses and humans. To look at, we'll just touch a little bit upon entraînement and that synchronization between horses and humans. So, our objectives.
So our specific objectives were to determine the efficacy of equine facilitated psychotherapy for veterans previously diagnosed with PTSD, presently diagnosed with PTSD, and of course my interest as a veterinarian to monitor the well-being of the horses at the same time. And we did this, as we did with the previous studies mentioned. We used polar heart rate monitors for both the humans and horses so that we collect the R-to-R recordings of the QRS waves in order to get our heart rate variability measures. We were able to use saliva for cortisol and oxytocin measures from the humans. That was convenient. And we used saliva for cortisol measures from the horses, and we collected blood for the oxytocin measures for the horses.
So the underlying theme of what we're going to talk about today is stress. And so we're considering the measurement characteristics of stress. We have to begin by asking the questions, what is stress? And so the answer is that stress is a construct which we cannot measure directly. So we never measure stress directly, we measure it indirectly. And so what we did is we established stress as a latent or a hidden variable. And we want to be able to get at a measure of stress. And so we do that with horses. We looked at the behavior rating scales, and we've had graduate students that have been working on helping us to condition these scales and improve the characteristics of the scales. We also looked at humans and their stress response. And again, so it's a perceived stress response and it's a subjective stress response. And so we use various kinds of measures of mood and anxiety and well-being. But then as a physiologist, I'm always thinking about the objective measures that could actually be correlate or be associated or be in agreement with those subjective measures. So we measured heart rate variability, we measured the time domain, the frequency domain, the nonlinear domains of heart rate variability, and I bring those up because they do report to different things that are happening physiologically. And then we also measured what we considered the more hormonal or physiological measures of oxytocin and cortisol, which is a known measure of stress. So, which is best, right? We're not really sure. Are they subjective ratings or are they objective ratings, or which is the best measure within that complement of rating type? So in terms of our responses, this graph here, you can see the red line at the top is the post-session response, and the blue line at the bottom is the pre-session response. So we measured the perception of stress among our human participants every day during the various sessions. So we had 4 different cohorts, and we carried this study on through COVID and through the pandemic, even though whenever there was an opening, we took advantage of that opening and made sure that when the patients were in the therapeutic sessions, that we actually were able to collect data. So this represents our grant being spread out over 18 months in terms of trying to collect data to be able to meet the requirements that we sought out in terms of our deliverables. We actually saw that on any given session day, there was an improvement in the perceived well-being by the veterans who were involved in the Equine Facilitated Psychotherapy program. Sorry, and it was statistically significant. And so again, with our anxiety response, we noticed, you'll see the blue line, again, the pre-session line, and the red line at the bottom. You can see the red line at the bottom. There was a significant decrease in anxiety every time there was a session, okay? And then in terms of our mood, how did they feel overall? There was an improvement in mood. Now, what is important here is while we saw these session responses, we did not see an overall change at the start of the session to the end of the session. In other words, what would have been great would be to have this, you know, here, and then actually have this way down here by the end of the session. We didn't see that.
So,
okay?
I'm just going to clarify that a bit. The participants were asked their anxiety level, mood level, and stress level before that daily EFP session and afterwards. And those changes were significant. When we compared week 1 to week 8 is what Bill's just referring to.
Right, okay. So we did see it every single day they were in there. Overall, the group effect was positive, okay? Now, in addition to that, we also had a psychologist who actually measured this at the start of the session, in the middle of the weeks, start of the entire cohort session, so the start of the weeks, and then in the middle of the sessions, and then at the end of the sessions, measured more of those trait-like characteristics. So the Beck Depression Inventory, the RANDS SF36, the State Trait Anger Expression Scales, PTSD checklist, because.
Yeah. Well, you know, in retrospect, we were really happy that we did have this additional. These additional measures to try to determine whether we had a therapeutic effect or therapy effect. And in talking to one of our psychologists at UPEI, the discussion was, if you feel better after interacting with the horses, that's therapeutic. But as therapy, we want a long-term result in daily life.
So we're really hoping that we can show this state effect, this trait effect as opposed to a state effect. And so what happened is you can see that while those comparisons of the pre, midpoint, and post were not significantly different because there's a lot of variation in the cohorts. They worked in small cohorts, but again, we had multiple small cohorts over the period. We didn't see a significant difference, but we did see a trend. Okay? And so as a statistician, I'm always trying to get people to forget about the dreaded p-value. I don't care about the p-value, but what I do care about is that we saw these trends because we really do only have a small slice of the population when we're starting to look at this. And so we saw that there was an improvement in the Beck depression inventory, but with a lot of variance. And we saw in our multidimensional anxiety questionnaire, we saw improvements. And in our in our PTSD checklist outcomes, we saw improvements, but as you can see, there's still a lot of variability within those personal responses. And in terms of the SF-36 relative to social functioning, we saw an improvement, okay, but a lot of variability. And then likewise in the anger expression scale, we saw that the overall scores dropped, but with lots of variability within those scores. So we're showing that we cannot measure in that small group a representation of true trait responses, but we are seeing state responses. So as we accumulate more data, we know that we're going to be able to show this trend and see whether it's an artifact or whether it's a real phenomenon of the event.
So we also measured the emotional responses of the horses. And we did this with a focus on measuring stress behaviors. And we used this stress ethogram, which was modified from Cami Haleski's team. And they developed it for therapeutic riding horses. So what we did was count the stress behaviors. And it was really interesting to see the frequency of stress behaviors across the different activities, which included baseline, so that's before the interaction with the veterans, while the veterans were grooming the horses, and immediately after walking the horses, which signified the end of the session. So you could see that head turning was a stress behavior that was seen in all activities, but it's really interesting to see that at the end of the session, pawing became increased in frequency. Now here's a graph which shows the mean and standard deviation of the behavior scores during baseline grooming and post-walking. And since I was there at many of the sessions, and I knew the horses who were veterans themselves in EFP programs, I thought it was a bit strange that the pawing behavior or that the stress behaviors increased at the end of the sessions. And so I went back and looked at the raw data, and we did see that there was one particular horse during one particular session who was apparently agitated and pawing like many more times than normal. So we did attribute the increase in pawing and the significant increase in stress behaviors to one particular horse, which we determined was an outlier. So again, it just points to the importance of not just looking at p-values, but knowing your data. And this horse was new to the program.
So as we said, we've said this many times, we didn't just look at those subjective responses either by us evaluating the performance of the horse or the behavior of the horse, or us asking, how do you feel? Okay, because those are subjective, and people will always kind of they will criticize those kinds of responses. So we decided we wanted to have some kind of an objective response. And even though it's an objective response, if I make up the scale, then how is that different than you telling me how you feel? So we needed to come up with a way of looking at objective measures that had validity and reliability and those kind of measurement characteristics that had stability and precision to them. So we looked at, as we said, salivary cortisol in humans and horses, and we looked at oxytocin in humans and horses, and we looked at HRV in humans and horses. And so what we saw is that in the observations on human participants, there was, again, we showed a red line and blue line, we see that there is a significant decrease in the cortisol levels of the humans over the time across the weeks. So again, now that's if you recall, we also had a feeling better. They had better mood and they had less anxiety and they felt better about themselves. And now we're also showing that cortisol levels drop. Okay, so now we have two different scales. We have a subjective and an objective scale, and those are significant. And then in oxytocin, we notice again from the blue line being the start and the red line being the end, we saw there was a significant rise in oxytocin in those humans. Okay, so not only did they say that they felt better, but we now have physiological evidence, not such thing as proof, but evidence to suggest that we're now on the right track in terms of what this program is showing. And again, these are statistically significant or important. We also saw that there was a significant decline in the overall average from pre to post levels of salivary cortisol in the horses. So we actually saw that the horses felt better about their responses across the activities, across the weeks. But again, in the week response, we never saw a significant change, but we did see from the activity responses. And then in terms of oxytocin, we did not see the change that we saw, the similar change that we saw in humans. We didn't see that increase in the post-session oxytocin in the horses. Okay.
So I'm sure many of you are familiar with heart rate variability measures, but I'll just reiterate a couple points about it. So heart rate variability analysis includes several measures, and they're primarily calculated from the RRR interval. I'll put that out, Bill. From the ECG. And from these R to R intervals, you can use software to get an analysis where you can get information on time domain, frequency domain, and nonlinear measures of heart rate variability. So I first went to an International Society of Equitation Science meeting, and there was a lot of discussion on heart rate variability. And so I thought I was going to go home and buy a polar monitor and put it on a horse and get the HRV measure. And so I've come a long way. But heart rate variability is really complex, as most of you know. A lot of different measures to consider, and they represent different things. Go ahead.
So here's the learning part of the HHRF part. So now we're going to have a lecture about heart rate variability, and there'll be a test after. Kidding, of course. But you know, it is important, as Laurie said, we have this measure of R to R interval, which is basically the distance between the R waves in a normal electrocardiogram or PQRST waves. And so that distance is what Polar uses and Kubios uses to be able to determine what's happening relative to the body. Now, one of the things we gain from that is that we can actually, we get to measure this distance, and that's going to be, the distance is going to be inversely related to the heart rate. But we can also measure the frequency domain, which is really the frequency. How often is what frequency means. So it's how often do we see certain types of patterns or oscillations or responses. How often did we see one beat with this distance and one beat with this distance and beats to beats to beats? So you're really counting the frequency of frequency. So if you don't think of it in terms of the underlying arithmetic, but think about it, you're just counting the patterns. That's what we're looking at in terms of the frequency domain. And then what I think is really exciting is this measure of non-linearity. So what is the distance between beats if we graph that information? So we took a basic R to R wave. We took it out of all the other software, and I wrote some code to actually look at what is the standard deviation of the beat-to-beat spacing. And you can see how when we are getting a response, how complex it is or how much it is spread out. And so that gives us a really good indication of what's happening relative to underlying physiological systems. So the fight or flight mechanism, which is the sympathetic nervous system, or the relax, it's going to be okay, which is the parasympathetic system that controls. And so that's really important when we're starting to talk about stress, because those underlying autonomic nervous systems are also integrated into our hormonal response systems. So here we saw that in humans, excuse me, when we looked at the time domain measures, we saw that there was an increase, there was a significant increase in heart rate over the time from the baseline to grooming to post-walk, and we also saw that there was a decline in the R to R, which is what we expect, as they're inversely related. So we get this really nice pattern where the time domain works and we know everything is happening the way it should be. And likewise, when we look at the frequency domain and we look at the nonlinear domains and the measures of the autonomic nervous system indices, we see that, yes, there was an increase in the sympathetic nervous system response, and that was significant from baseline to grooming to post-activity. So that, the sympathetic fight or flight mechanism is working in these people. And then we also see that the parasympathetic system was at a level of arousal that was monitoring the fight or flight mechanism when they walk in. So you imagine, you've got a person with PTSD walks into the barn, and they're aware and they're activated, right? So then
during the session, during grooming, that system drops a little bit more, and then it drops even more in post-walk. But then again, the SNS is going up. So then we said in horses.
So it was interesting then with the horses, we did not see any significant difference in the HRV measures indicative of the sympathetic nervous system or parasympathetic nervous system.
And that's a time domain, so that matches. And this
So,
is-
yeah, nonlinear. I said that fairly quickly, but I always like to look at the heart rate myself because I know what a horse's heart rate should be. And that's a little bit of a test for me to say this is good data or not data. So we like to report heart rate and we like to report our intervals because many of the analyses use that measure. So there was no significant difference in the heart rate or our intervals for the horses over different activities. But more interesting to me was what's going on with the horse in response to the environment or the session that they're involved in. Is the parasympathetic nervous system, what's going on with it, or the sympathetic nervous system? And there was no significant difference in the autonomic nervous system across the activities. So that's good news for wanting to confirm that the horses were not stressed. And in fact, well, we'll talk more about that when we get the objective data as
Right.
well.
So in other words, it was a neutral stress to the horses where there was something happening. I'm still in your line, sorry. Okay, so does heart rate variability help to explain the complexity of our work? So one of the terms that we talk about a lot is whether or not things are complicated or things are complex. And so in our case, we think that there's a lot of complexity in the research that you are thinking about relative to humans and horses. Complicated is difficult, but it's doable. Sending a person to the moon and bringing them back, that's complicated, but we can do it. There's a system in place. Things that we're talking about here where we're getting changes in perception and human variability that are interacting with the responses, that's not a linear system. That's not an easy system. That is a complex system. So we find that, as you say, recall that we're interested in measuring stress. We're looking at how stress is being able to be measured, even though we said we can't measure it. We have to use some other proxy to measure it. So how do we measure that, especially in a session of equine facilitated psychotherapy? Or up to this point, we've been using standardized measurements. We talk about going and getting some blood, and then we get some saliva, and we use some benchtop techniques so we can actually look at concentrations. Or we look at heart rate signals and how we can measure those kinds of signals. But then we take all that standard laboratory type measurement and we try to make sense of it from a research perspective or from my perspective as a biostatistician. So how do you actually say what is really happening? Yes, we can see these two systems working in concert, but what's bringing them together? So in our case, we started to look at some of those other kinds of arithmetic approaches that help us to make sense of the data. And here we look at measures of agreement. And in particular, we're looking at a technique called the Bland-Altman technique for measuring agreements between two systems that are purporting to measure the same thing, but using two different scales to measure the same thing. So we're saying, well, how are we going to get those bananas and those tangerines to work together? Because they're two different things, right? But we know they're going to work together. So in this case, we looked at the Bland-Altman plot for cortisol, which again is a hormone. And then we've got the sympathetic nervous system index of the autonomic nervous system, which is a derivative using a nonlinear measure of a linear measure of time. And we're going to say that that nonlinear measure of a linear measure of time is going to be related to a hormonal response of the body. So how do you do that? And you can't. So Bland and Altman came up with, they're two British statisticians that came up with a technique that if you ever want to be able to compare a new approach to a gold standard, you have to be able to show how your new approach provides the same precision and agreement of measurement as the gold standard. Or why bother putting the new approach in there if it's not going to be as good? And so in this case, you can see that there is a lot of agreement when we standardize the score. So when I want to take apples and oranges and I want to put them together as being two different scales,
I need to come up with a standardized score. So some of you will remember way back in arithmetic where you created Z-scores or standardized scores. So if we can standardize these scores, compare to the group mean and adjust for the variance, then we can actually come up with a measure that allows us to mathematically compare two things that are not scaled the same way. And in this case, we're able to show that there is a lot of agreement. Not 100% agreement, not perfect agreement. As you see, these two red lines represent the actual thresholds for the tolerance of being able to say these things agree. And we can see that there's a lot of agreement in the responses between the cortisol, which is a hormonal response, and this nonlinear index of the sympathetic nervous system. There's also the same kind of response in the horse participants. We were seeing that what was happening in terms of the cortisol, even though we weren't seeing a significant difference, we were seeing the same kind of similar agreements between the horse's cortisol response and their fight or flight mechanism response, even though it was a neutral response. And then we looked at them together, and you can see that when in this environment, we actually have that there is a really good balance with not 100% agreement between humans' agreement and horses. And the point here is that this zero line says there should be no difference, because our y-axis in this case is how much of a difference. And so we're saying very little difference here. This is the zero line. Most scores line up around the zero in terms of their difference score. So there's a lot of agreement when we start to use the Bland-Altman plots. So then we got excited about this. Well, I did. And then what happened was we started to look at some of these other kinds of scales. And we said, you know what, let's think about oxytocin and well-being. Because now we don't just have two physiological systems that any scientist or physician or a veterinarian would say, well, I've got a physiological system, so it's got to be good. And I've got another physiological system, so it's got to be good. So if I put them together and they agree, then I guess that makes sense to me. But what about when you go into the other part of the building where the psychologists are? And they don't have the physiological systems, and they have a lot of perceived responses. So stress we can't measure. Remember, we use latent variables. So now we're suggesting, how do we bring this latent variable of well-being together with oxytocin? And so we saw that oxytocin went up and well-being went up. And so is there agreement? I'm not talking about the C word, correlation, right? I'm talking about, are they agreeing? Are they flying together in the same three-dimensional space so that we actually see they agree? And so the answer is yes. We see a lot of agreement, and again, statistically, I could argue this. We could be at a biostats conference and I'd be saying, you know what, we got appropriate p-values and our confidence levels suggest that we're representing the population, blah, blah, blah. But here it is. We're getting a really good agreement between the way oxytocin is responding as well as the way the perceived, or the individual's perception of their stress is responding. So again, very strong and statistically important, okay? So
back to our question. Does higher variability contribute to our understanding of stress? Well, not only is stress complex, but as we all agreed on, HRV is complex. And so I think it really gives an insight when we're looking at the hormonal levels, the behavioral responses, and the HRV as well to put the real picture together. For instance, with the humans, I'm going to steal your punchline.
go ahead.
For instance, with the humans, going into the project, I thought, well, if their stress decreases, then parasympathetic nervous system should increase, and sympathetic nervous system should decrease. And as you saw, we didn't have that. We had the humans having decreased cortisol, but increased SNS. And upon reviewing some literature, we found that that likely indicates the veterans were activated or animated, which can be a great thing if they're having comorbidities such as depression. So, and we would have missed that if we just did cortisol. So all of these measures together and really having Bill be able to do all these different analyses really is insightful.
So it's like when Nancy was introducing the day to us. If we were to if she was to wear a heart rate monitor at the start of the day, your sympathetic nervous system would be aroused. You would be activated.
Well, you wouldn't be stressed. You're among friends. You were very excited to tell how great this organization is. So your cortisol level would probably be dropping, and your oxytocin level would probably be going up. And your heart rate would be saying to us, whoa, she's ready to bolt out of the room. But she's not, right? Because we're seeing that we can actually, by using these more complicated arithmetic techniques, we can actually start to separate those signals into what they really are meaning. So we're getting away from the conjecture of, oh, there must be something synchronizing happening here, to looking at the true scales of what's happening and making sense of our data.
Okay, just to reiterate, the horses seem to perceive the EFP as a neutral stimulus. They do not have, except for one horse as an outlier, the horse's well-being was fine. But really valuable information to know, especially for these horses that are doing session after session. So my input for that would be, this monitoring is really important for therapeutic, using equines in therapeutic programs. We didn't get into synchronization, but if one of the theories is that the human and horse are synchronizing, then obviously you would worry that the horses would be picking up stress rather than the humans picking up the calmness. So it goes both ways. We're going to continue to work on our analysis of our synchronization and report that in the publication. In the humans, we saw evidence that the EFP was efficacious. We saw positive results with primarily daily sessions. But what's really great is that even though we might say, well, you might say, well, that still only shows therapeutic effect, at least we have concrete data that is at least therapeutic. So the daily sessions are impacting their life that day. And we think if we have an additional dose of EFP, we may get more of the therapy effects, and that would be our next project. And of course, we want to, did you want to say anything else to wrap it up?
I want to comment about our teaser, but go ahead.
Okay, but while I'm speaking, we want to acknowledge that we had a huge team on this. You know, this took a lot of work. We had the great team at Streamview Ranch where the EFP happened with the registered psychologist overseeing all the therapy, and of course their equine specialists. We had great students we got to have involved. And technical support, again, invaluable, because I'm not running the ELISA. We're the cortisol and oxytocin. We didn't send it away, we did it ourselves after all. Of course the veterans and the horses. And you want to say one thing?
So we'll take questions if you want, but one question I know some of you are going to be thinking about is, so you used Polar and you used Kubios for your measurements, and we did explore heart math, but one of the things that it always troubles me is this notion that you're getting the same measure on the horses as you're getting on, the same measure on the horses as you're getting on from a Polar monitor as you're getting on an ECG. And so we're right in the process right now of showing that there is tremendous agreement between ECG monitors on horses with Polar monitors. So we have really good data, and I thought I had the slide of it and I don't have it. But again, for the next HHRF projects that we're going to come along with, we'll be able to show really good data on this, the field work that we're doing right now. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much to HHRF for funding our project and for inviting us.
Glad to have you. Any questions?
What was the sample size of horses and humans?
They differed. So we had a set of horses that.
Yeah, we had a set. We had about 10 horses available. Certain horses. So we had about 10 horses available for use in the EFP. We had 4 veterans paired up with one of those horses for a total of 8 weeks. The sessions were an hour each week.
We had 4 cohorts
Yeah.
of those. So we had 16 patients over 8 weeks, over the time, 18 months. So we had different, so we actually got seasonal effect, whether or not there was a winter response, a spring response, a late summer or fall response as well. Again, we're limited by the sample size as a function of what can be done from an EFP perspective, right?
Now, some of the horses were in more than one cohort. And, you know, for the most part, a veteran had a horse the whole time. There was maybe one instance where one of the horses had an ulcer in their eye and had to be replaced with another. So for the most part, we tried to pair up a veteran with a horse. They stayed with that horse for the whole 8 weeks. New cohort of 4 came in, they got paired with a horse. In some cases, it would be a horse that was in cohort 1. In other cases, it would be new horses entering. Does that answer your question?
Follow up, I'll go ahead.
How about we?
Okay, so my question was about dosing. So where did you decide on 8 weeks? My own personal outcomes work with veterans, we saw that there was no change until after, like long-term change until after about 10 sessions. So I'm super curious about any future
That's
dosing
great.
work that you do.
That's good to know. Well, of course, we consulted with the psychologist, and she recommended the program be 8 weeks. So that was based on her experience, which was probably fine for our initial foray into this. We did consider it, you know, not really a pilot project, but it probably was a pilot project. So we learned a lot from it, and now we're ready to do longer sessions, but that really came from the psychologist who.
In the ranch. I mean, that's what she
Yeah,
was.
yeah.
And your grant time,
Yeah.
you had to work within the timeline of the grant.
Yeah, yeah. So we're really interested that you have something after 10 sessions, and that may mean to us we don't have to go 15 or 20. Oh, she's-
I just wanted to concur. I
Pardon me?
just wanted to concur, and I understand this is not, we're all working with what we have the best we
Yeah.
can, but we tend to find that there's a shift at about 6 weeks,
Mhm.
and then there's a more of a development and stability of change that then we can measure better after 12.
Excellent. Okay, thank you.
So how, within this 8 weeks, how many sessions were there like, per week?
There's only 1 week per session.
Um,
I mean, 1 session per week. Yeah.
So it's like if you started like, I don't know, Friday or a Monday, would it just be like that
Yeah,
particular day each week for 8 weeks?
yes.
Interesting.
Now, there was probably, if there was a holiday in there, you know, they missed that week.
We also live on an island that's in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and so there is a thing called storm days. And so, you know, that really affects a lot of things.
So, I guess follow-up-ish. So let's say, I don't know, big storm came in, and that Monday or Friday or whichever day that you were having the sessions on, you just say, oops, sorry, canceled for today, but we can do the next day.
We made it up in the next day or that,
Well-
or the next week, yeah.
What would happen is if we missed a week, of course, we'd go a week longer.
Mhm.
And everyone was, one of our students for each cohort was in constant contact via text.
Right.
So that's how we communicated. Yeah. You know, the other thing about it, I don't know if you guys find this, but we had 4 women veterans in our first cohort, and none of them missed a session. And our psychologist said that was amazing. So that may have been part of the decision to do 8 weeks. And we lost 2 veterans in the last cohort. So they're a
They
bit.
were men.
Yeah. So that's, you know, that's what we relied on our psychologist to say, you know, make sure we didn't push them, so that we didn't get any corporation.
So I have one more question, so follow-up. So when you guys did lose those 2 veterans, would you just go around the island and ask? Or would you just continue with your research?
Well, we had to. Again, the psychologist was really in charge of getting the participants. So we relied on her to say, we need to just go ahead because we've got 2 other people to consider, or, we need to look. And really, that was my take on it. There are 4 people involved, 2 of them were committed. We're not going to change things on them. So I felt that we were pretty happy we only lost 2. Yeah.
Last question.
Pressure's on. I was interested as you were speaking, is there any way to determine the participants if they had prior horse experience or not, and if that was any way indicated to them if they would?
Yeah, with our demographic information, we collected that. There might have been 1 or 2 that did. Majority did not.
Right.
And as you know, I'm bringing that up, the demographics, there's all kinds of variables. It's very difficult to control for all of those. So we didn't do any stats on that. Certainly something to consider in the future. Yeah.
Do we have time for a couple more questions? I'm not sure, I'm looking at
We
Sally.
have 2 more minutes.
Great.
Mark?
Okay.
Yeah, I have a quick question, and you can answer this as yes or no. At first, I love Bland Altman, so thank you for bringing those gentlemen up. Second, have you all looked, I understand there's portable electroencephalograms now. You may want to throw something at me, because that is definitely a Star Trek mission going into places no man should go. But have you looked into that as an additional measurement on top of the heart rate variability, or is that just dark and scary?
No, actually, we'd love to try it. We have a animal welfare specialist researcher at the ABC, and she has used it on cows. Yeah.
Dark and scary.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's just empty, I don't know.
But definitely, I'm definitely interested. Sounds like it may not be the easiest modality, but we'll probably pursue it with her.
Yeah, I mean, just getting the validity for
Yeah,
these
exactly.
portable EEG units, I don't think we're there yet, I don't know that much,
Well,
but
she isn't, actually, we were gonna do a sleep study with the horses and use it. She mostly focuses on cows. So she feels that validity's been shown for bovine. So we'd have to do that for the equine, or I'm certainly not up to date with that literature, but we have discussed it. So
We've also talked about gaze and gaze deviation. So another life I live is I'm a concussion researcher, and so in humans we measure gaze and gaze deviation under certain kinds of conditions. So the Harry Potter concept of mad eye moody when it's flying around, we can get that. So given that we have head turn as one of the most common or most frequent behaviors of a horse, I have often said, Laurie, we should be using our visual gaze and gaze deviation glasses on the horse, which is not going to happen, but to measure eye movement and whether or not the horse is actually focusing, which again would lead to us getting back into more of the cranial kinds of nerve
yeah,
functions.
the central commander of all this.
Exactly.
Cool, thank you.